My name is Evelyn Vance. I am 32 years old, and 6 months ago, my mother stood up at our family Thanksgiving dinner, looked me straight in the eye in front of 30 relatives, and announced to the entire room that I was the only Vance who could not even afford to buy a single car garage, let alone a home. She was dead wrong, but not in any way she could have possibly imagined. My father, Richard, just kept his head down, cutting his turkey into tiny, precise pieces like he was trying to disappear into his plate. My sister, Victoria, leaned over with that specific brand of pitying smile that makes you want to scream and whispered, "You are just jealous, are you not?" 2 weeks later, I invited Victoria over for tea at my new address. When she walked through the front gate, she was shaking so hard she could barely hold her smartphone. She tried to dial our mother's number 3 times before she finally got through, and her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. She said, "Mom, you have to get here right now. You have not seen anything like this." But that moment was 14 years in the making. Before I take you back to the very beginning of how I built a life they were never meant to see, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you feel this story has earned it. I am truly curious to know who is listening. So please drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, let me set the scene for that Thanksgiving night in Bellevue. The dining table sat 14 in the main room, with the rest of the cousins spilling into the hallway. My mother, Eleanor, moved through that house like she was the lead architect of Victoria's life. She pointed out the custom crown molding to Aunt Patrice and ran her hand along the white quartz kitchen island as if it were a holy relic. She was doing everything in her power to broadcast a single message. This is what a successful daughter looks like. I was tucked into the corner of the table, squeezed between a second cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years and a large bowl of cranberry sauce. My mother was speaking to the entire room, her voice never dropping an octave, because she wanted to make sure every person heard her version of the truth. She said, "Evelyn is still renting that little studio in Seattle. Bless her heart. That tech thing she does is just so unpredictable. I worry about her constantly." Patrice glanced at me with a look of genuine sorrow. I just forced a smile and took a sip of water. Then Victoria, from the head of the table, tilted her head at me the way you would look at a stray dog in the rain. She asked if I wanted her to talk to her real estate brokerage because property is way more stable than whatever it is I do in the basement of some office building. I told her I was fine, but she just sighed and said she was only trying to help. What none of them knew was that my tech thing was a role as a cloud infrastructure lead for a global firm. They did not know about the 7-figure portfolio I was managing or the fact that I was the one people called when the entire digital backbone of a hospital system went down. To Eleanor and Victoria, if it did not involve a yard and a white picket fence they could brag about, it was not real work. After dinner, the air in that house felt thick with their condescension. My mother's narrative was like a press release she had been distributing for a decade. Victoria was the golden child who saved her pennies, and Evelyn was the struggling artist of the digital world who could barely keep the lights on. As I walked to my car that night, I checked my phone. Victoria had started a new family group chat to plan the Christmas retreat. Everyone was in it. Everyone except me. When I drove back to my 480-square-foot studio in Seattle, the contrast was staggering. My apartment had one window that rattled every time the light rail passed by. The kitchen faucet had a drip that occurred every 2 seconds, a rhythmic reminder of everything I was supposed to be lacking. I sat on my floor with my laptop open, debugging a server migration for a client, and I thought about Eleanor's face when she talked about my failure. For years, I had allowed them to use me as the family cautionary tale. I was the daughter who lived small so they could feel big. I had kept my promotions quiet, my raises hidden, and my investments private. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew that in the Vance family, success was only valuable if it could be used as a weapon. Eleanor measured worth in square footage and neighborhood prestige. She had spent the last decade telling the aunts and uncles that I was a charity case, effectively turning the entire family tree against my actual reality. I had messages from cousins offering me old furniture and links to low-income housing because my mother had convinced them I was drowning. But as I sat there in the dark of my studio, listening to the train whistle in the distance, I realized that the silence I had maintained was no longer a shield. It was a foundation. My mother wanted a stage to humiliate me, but I was busy building a stage of my own that would leave her speechless. I looked at the deed in my email inbox, a document they did not know existed, for a property that would redefine everything they thought they knew about me. The humiliation at Thanksgiving was the final catalyst. I was done being the footnote in their story. In 2 weeks, the narrative was going to change forever, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who held the keys to the truth. The rattling of the light rail was the soundtrack to my 20s. Every time the train surged past my studio in Seattle, the single-pane window in my 480-square-foot unit would vibrate in its frame, a frantic metallic chatter that mirrored the anxiety in my chest. I lived on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like wet concrete and old mail. The kitchen faucet had a leak that I could never quite fix. No matter how hard I cranked the handle, it dripped on a steady 2-second cycle. Drip, drip, drip. It was a metronome of my own perceived failure, counting down the seconds of a life that felt like it was going nowhere. At 29, I was a systems analyst at a mid-sized firm. On paper, my salary was $72,500. In Seattle, that sounds like a decent start, but the reality was a different story. Every month, $1,600 vanished into my student loan payments. I drove a 2011 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on Tuesdays. I kept a spreadsheet on my phone that was more detailed than most corporate ledgers. It told me down to the very cent how much I could spend on groceries. My diet was a repetitive cycle of ramen, frozen peas, and whatever fruit was on sale at the discount market. I did not hate my life, but I was exhausted. I figured this was just the cost of starting from zero. What I did not realize back then was that I was not supposed to be starting from zero. My mother, Eleanor, had spent years telling a very different story to anyone who would listen. At family dinners, she would sigh and tell Aunt Patrice or Uncle Silas how much she worried about poor Evelyn. She made my life sound like a tragic drama. She would mention the leaky faucet and the tiny apartment as if they were symbols of my lack of ambition. But she never mentioned the reason I had those student loans in the first place. I remember the day it happened like it was yesterday. I was 18 years old, 2 weeks away from leaving for my freshman year at the University of Washington. My mother sat me down at our old oak kitchen table. Her voice was soft, wrapped in that rehearsed brand of sympathy she used when she was about to take something away. She told me the college fund my grandmother had started for me simply did not survive the market volatility. She said the $58,750 was gone. I sat there and cried while she held me, and the very next morning, she was right there helping me fill out the federal loan paperwork like it was the most natural thing in the world. She made it seem like we were a team facing a disaster together. Meanwhile, my sister Victoria was the family miracle. She bought her first house at 26, a beautiful place in Bellevue with manicured lawns and high ceilings. My mother told the entire Vance family the same narrative. Victoria is just so smart with her money. Victoria saved every penny. Victoria has a plan. The contrast was sharp and painful. Victoria was the golden child of real estate, and I was the tech girl renting a shoebox. The truth did not come out in a grand confrontation. It came in a phone call on a rainy Tuesday night in November. I was sitting on the floor of my studio, my laptop open as I worked through a complex server migration for a client. My back ached, and the faucet was doing its 2-second drip. My phone buzzed on the floor next to me. It was Uncle Silas. He was not someone who called just to chat, so I knew something was wrong. His voice sounded heavy, like he had been carrying a weight for too long. He told me he had been going back and forth about whether to tell me, but he could not stay silent anymore. He said, "Evelyn, your mother did not lose that money in the market." I was at the bank that day. I saw her sign the withdrawal form. She took every bit of that $58,750 the month you turned 18. I told her it was wrong, but she told me to mind my own business. I did not say a word. I felt the cold air from the window hit the back of my neck. Silas continued, telling me the money went straight into a joint account. And 2 weeks later, Victoria used it as a down payment for her house. I slid off my chair and sat on the cold linoleum of my kitchen floor. I did not cry. Something behind my ribs just went quiet, like a pilot light going out in a dark basement. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger when I finally thanked him. After I hung up, I stayed on that floor for hours. I ran the math in my head. $58,750 taken in 2010. With even basic growth over the years, that fund would have been worth nearly $75,000 by the time I graduated. That was the money that was supposed to buy my freedom. Instead, it had bought Victoria's front door. The worst part was realizing the depth of the gaslighting. For over a decade, my mother had watched me struggle. She had watched me eat ramen and drive a car that was falling apart, all while using my struggle as a prop to make herself look like a concerned parent. She had turned me into the family charity case to cover up the fact that she had robbed me to favor my sister. Every time she offered to send me links to cheaper apartments or suggested I find a husband with a house, she was twisting the knife she had put in my back years ago. I realized then that Gloria, my mother, did not lose arguments. She redirected them. If I called her that night and screamed, she would have a million excuses. She would say Silas was bitter. She would say I was being dramatic. She would call every aunt and cousin within an hour to tell them that I was having a breakdown and lashing out at her. I would be the villain, and she would be the victim once again. I looked at the dripping faucet and then at the spreadsheet on my laptop. I realized that the only way to win was not to fight her on her stage. I had to build a stage so large and so undeniable that her lies would simply wither in the light of it. I adjusted my savings goal on my spreadsheet. I decided right then that I would not be the footnote in the Vance family history. I was going to be the one who owned the book. I closed my laptop at 3 a.m, the sound of the light rail shaking the glass one last time, and for the first time in years, I slept with a plan that was entirely my own. The phone call came on a Tuesday in November. I was sitting on the floor of my Seattle studio, my laptop open on a coffee table made of reclaimed pallets. I was debugging a complex firewall configuration for a client presentation the next morning. The blue light of the screen was the only thing illuminating the room, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. My phone buzzed on the rug next to me. The caller ID read Silas. Uncle Silas was my father's older brother, a man of few words who mostly kept to himself on his farm across the state. We texted on birthdays and sent cards at Christmas, but a random Tuesday night call was unheard of. I picked up, thinking perhaps something had happened to my father. Silas, I said, is everything okay? His voice sounded heavy, like he had been pacing a floor for a long time before finding the courage to dial. Evelyn, he said, and then there was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, a ragged, uncertain sound. I have been going back and forth about this for years. I told myself it was not my place, that I should mind my own business. But after seeing you at the last family gathering, seeing the way your mother speaks to you, I cannot carry this anymore. Carry what, Uncle Silas? I felt a cold prickle of apprehension crawl up my spine. The dripping faucet in the kitchen seemed to grow louder in the silence. Drip, drip, drip. Your mother did not lose your college fund, Evelyn. She did not lose a single cent on the market. My heart skipped a beat, then began to throb in my throat. Silas continued, his voice gaining a hard edge of resentment. I was at the bank that day in March. I was standing right there at the next teller window when I saw Eleanor sign the withdrawal form. She took all of it. Every bit of that $58,750 the month you turned 18. I told her then it was wrong. I told her that money belonged to your future. She told me to stay out of it and did not speak to me for 2 years afterward. I did not say anything. I could not. I felt my grip on the phone tighten until my knuckles turned white. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas was still talking, but his voice felt miles away. The money went straight into her joint account with your father. 2 weeks later, Victoria closed on the down payment for her house in Bellevue, the one Eleanor tells everyone Victoria saved for so diligently. I slid off my chair and onto the floor. The cold tile of the kitchen area pressed against the back of my legs. I pressed the phone against my ear so hard it hurt, as if I could physically hold on to the truth he was giving me. I did not cry. Something behind my ribs just went quiet, like a pilot light going out in a dark, empty basement. The heat of my anger was replaced by a terrifying, frozen clarity. "Evelyn, are you there?" Silas asked softly. "I am here," I whispered. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger, someone much older and much more tired than I was. Silas told me he had kept the bank statements. He had made copies years ago because he knew this day would come. He said he would mail them to me when I was ready. Before I tell you what was in those documents and how they changed the course of my life, I want to take a moment to speak to you. Have you ever had a moment where the ground fell out from under you because someone you trusted, someone who was supposed to protect you, was actually the one holding the knife? If you have ever had to rebuild your reality from the ashes of a lie, please hit the subscribe button. I want this channel to be a place for those of us who had to become our own heroes. And if you are comfortable, share a bit of your story in the comments. Have you ever been the family's scapegoat while someone else took the credit? I read every single one, and knowing we are not alone in these struggles is where the healing starts. After I hung up with Silas, I sat on that cold floor for a very long time. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of a country I did not recognize. I ran the math over and over. $58,750 withdrawn in 2010. If that money had stayed in a modest index fund, with even conservative growth over the last 14 years, it would be worth nearly $90,000 today. That was the money that was supposed to be my safety net. It was the money that would have allowed me to take risks, to start my own firm earlier, to live in a place where the windows did not rattle. Instead, that money had paid for Victoria's front door. It had paid for the quartz countertops my mother raved about at Thanksgiving. It had paid for the lifestyle that Eleanor used as a yardstick to measure my own supposed failure. The money was a blow, but the gaslighting was the true wound. For 14 years, my mother had watched me struggle with 2 jobs. She had watched me count pennies for groceries and drive a car with a taped-up window. And every time she saw me, she used my struggle as a way to elevate Victoria. She had turned me into a charity case to cover her own theft. She had called every aunt, uncle, and cousin to distribute a narrative that I was struggling and unpredictable, all while she was sitting on the secret of how she had sabotaged my start in life. I looked at my laptop, still glowing with the firewall code. I realized that if I confronted her now, I would lose. Eleanor Vance did not lose arguments. She was a master of redirection. She would call me hysterical. She would say Silas was a bitter old man. She would tell the family I was having a breakdown because I was jealous of Victoria's success. I would be the villain again, and she would be the victimized mother trying to help her ungrateful daughter. I realized that if I wanted to change the ending of this story, I had to stop playing by her rules. I needed to stop being the footnote in her version of the Vance family history. At 2 a.m, I opened a new spreadsheet. I titled it The Stage. I did not need an apology. I did not even need the money back. What I needed was to build a life so undeniably large and successful that her lies would have nowhere left to hide. I adjusted my savings goals. I looked at my career trajectory, not as a climb, but as a tactical mission. I closed my laptop at 3:15, and for the first time in my life, the dripping of the faucet did not sound like failure. It sounded like a countdown. My mother had spent 14 years writing my story as a tragedy. I was about to take the pen back. The silence in my apartment after I hung up on Uncle Silas was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic drip from the kitchen faucet. Drip, drip, drip. For 14 years, that sound had felt like a clock counting down my failures. But that night, sitting on the cold linoleum floor of my Seattle studio, the sound changed. It started to sound like a drum beat. I knew one thing for certain. Confrontation was a trap. Eleanor Vance did not lose arguments. She redirected them. If I called her right then and screamed about the $58,750 she had stolen from my future, I already knew how the next 48 hours would play out. She would cry. She would say Silas was bitter and confused. She would call every aunt, uncle, and cousin in the Vance family tree, to explain that poor Evelyn was having a mental breakdown and lashing out at her own mother. I would be the villain. She would be the martyr, and the truth would be buried under another layer of her manufactured sympathy. Confrontation gives liars a stage. I decided right then, at 2 in the morning, that I would not give her that stage. Instead, I would build my own. I got up off the floor, wiped my face, and opened my laptop. The blue light felt like a spotlight in the dark room. I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it The Stage. It had 3 simple columns: monthly income, monthly savings target, and the ultimate goal. In the final cell, I typed a 7-figure number. It looked impossible, a jagged mountain of digits staring back at me from the screen of a woman who currently ate frozen peas to save for rent. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at my bank account as a measure of my worth. I was looking at it as a tactical arsenal. I closed the laptop at 3:15, set my alarm for 6, and went to sleep with a cold, sharp clarity I had never known. The following Sunday, the gaslighting began in earnest. My mother called, her voice dripping with that rehearsed, soft compassion that always made my skin crawl. She told me she had run into Aunt Patrice at the market and that Patrice knew a landlord in Milwaukee with some affordable units. She asked if I wanted the number, implying that I was clearly struggling to keep my head above water in Seattle. I gripped my phone, looking at the spreadsheet on my screen, and simply said, "I am not looking for a new place, Mom." She sighed, that long, disappointed sound she used whenever I didn't play the part of the victim. "Oh, I just thought you mentioned your rent went up," she said. I hadn't mentioned that because it hadn't happened, but it didn't matter. After she hung up, I checked Facebook. Aunt Patrice had already messaged me about the landlord. Uncle Dennis had sent a note saying there was no shame in downsizing. Even my cousin Laura sent a message saying she was thinking of me in my tough spot. Eleanor Vance didn't just tell lies. She distributed them like corporate memos. She had turned me into a family charity case, a cautionary tale told over coffee to make everyone else feel more secure in their own lives. She was the author of my life story, and she was writing me as a tragedy. That same afternoon, I saw Victoria's latest post. It was a photo of her newly remodeled kitchen in Bellevue. The white quartz countertops were gleaming under designer pendant lights. The caption read, "So grateful for this space. Thanks, Mom, for always believing in me." The post was dated November 17th, my birthday. I didn't cry. I didn't comment. I just opened my spreadsheet and adjusted my savings column upward by another $200 a month. That meant no more streaming subscriptions, no more weekend coffees, and definitely no new clothes for the next year. I was fine with that. My mother measured my worth in square footage, and I was done trying to convert my life into her currency. At work, I decided to stop being invisible. I sought out Diane Prescott, our VP of Infrastructure. Diane was 56 years old with a sharp silver bob and reading glasses she wore on a chain. She was the kind of woman who could dismantle a complex network architecture in 12 minutes while drinking an espresso. I didn't tell her about my family drama. I just asked her one question. "Diane, what does it take to move up to the next level here?" She looked at me over her glasses, her eyes scanning me like a security audit. "You are already doing the work, Evelyn," she said. "You just need to stop hiding in the server room." She pushed a thick file across her desk. It was a proposal for a massive enterprise security audit for a regional hospital chain. It was our biggest client, the project was mid-pivot, and the previous team lead had just quit. "It is ugly," Diane warned. "Tight deadlines, high stakes, and a lot of late nights. But if you land this, the people in the C-suite will know your name." I took the file. For the next 11 months, my life became a blur of code, coffee, and meal prep chicken. I worked 12-hour days, sometimes 14. I lived in the dark, quiet corners of the office long after the cleaning crews had left. I automated 40% of my paycheck into an investment account and pretended that money did not exist. I became a ghost to my friends and a mystery to my family. I stopped sharing anything about my career with my mother. Every time I had tried in the past, she would wave it off. "Oh, that computer thing," she would say. "Are they even going to keep you?" When I told her about a project win, she would change the subject to Victoria's new patio furniture within 2 sentences. So I just stopped. And the amazing thing was, nobody noticed. My mother continued to send me links to cheap apartments and job postings for administrative assistants. I would just reply, "I am fine, Mom." It became our ritual. She would push her narrative of my failure, and I would push my silent accumulation of success. The hospital audit shipped on time and under budget. The client was so impressed, they renewed their contract for 3 years. Diane sent me a 2-line email the day the deal closed. "Nice work. Come see me Monday. A year can change everything if you let it." On that Monday, Diane promoted me to Cloud Infrastructure Lead. My salary jumped to $112,000, plus a significant performance bonus. I didn't post about it on social media. I didn't call my father. I didn't tell a soul. I just went home to my 480 square foot studio, listened to the light rail rattle the window, and updated my spreadsheet. I was no longer the footnote in the Vance family history. I was the one who was holding the pen. And for the first time, I was actually looking forward to the next time my mother tried to tell me who I was. A year can change everything if you let it, but it changes even more when you do not let anyone else know it is happening. By February 2023, I was no longer just the systems analyst in the rattling studio apartment. Under the mentorship of Diane Prescott, I had moved from being a participant in the architecture of our cloud infrastructure to being the lead designer. Diane had pushed a file across her desk 10 months earlier, warning me it was ugly, and I had taken that ugliness and turned it into a masterclass of efficiency. I was leading the enterprise security audit for a regional hospital chain, a project with zero room for error. If the servers went down, lives were on the line. If the data leaked, the company was finished. I lived in a world of high stakes and high latency, working 14-hour days until the code began to blur into the patterns of my sleep. My morning ritual was always the same: a cup of black coffee at 5:30 a.m., a quick check of the global server health, and then a deep dive into the architecture that would keep thousands of patients' records secure. While the world slept, I was building digital fortresses. While the city of Seattle buzzed with life outside my window, I was carving out a future that existed only on my screen and in my secret spreadsheets. My salary had undergone a transformation that felt surreal. What started as $72,500 had climbed rapidly as I proved my worth. After the successful hospital migration, Diane called me into her office, not for a reprimand, but for a reorganization. I was promoted to Senior Manager of Infrastructure Operations. My new base salary was $165,000, with a performance bonus structure that could push me even higher. I remember the moment I saw the new digital pay stub. I was sitting at my scarred maple desk, the one I had found at an estate sale for $40. The light rail train surged past my window, making the glass chatter in its frame, but for the first time, I did not feel the vibration of the city's poverty. I felt the vibration of power. I opened my spreadsheet, the one I had created at 2 a.m. months ago, and I updated the monthly income cell. The 7-figure target at the bottom of the page suddenly looked like a destination rather than a dream. Yet, as my professional world expanded, I realized I had to shrink my presence in the Vance family narrative even further. It was a tactical necessity. I had learned early on that in the eyes of my mother, Eleanor, my work was nothing more than a computer thing. To her, a career was only real if it was tangible. If it involved a storefront or a title, she could easily explain to Aunt Patrice over a glass of Chardonnay. I remember a Sunday dinner at the old house in Bellevue. Victoria was holding court, describing the new crown molding she had installed in her foyer. She was talking about contractors and square footage costs, and the entire table was leaning in, hanging on every word. I tried, just once, to share a bit of my world. I mentioned that I had just finished a deployment that secured 40,000 medical records. My mother didn't even look up from her mashed potatoes. "That is nice, Evelyn," she said, her voice flat. "But are they even going to keep you? I heard that tech companies are laying off thousands. You should really talk to Victoria's husband about a more stable line of work. Insurance is always hiring." Victoria tilted her head at me with that familiar saccharine pity. She told me that if I needed help with my resume, she had a friend who did career coaching for people who were struggling to find their path. I just took a sip of water and looked at my plate. I realized then that my success was invisible to them because it didn't fit the script they had written for me. I was the struggling daughter. I was the cautionary tale. If I showed them the $165,000 salary, they would not celebrate me. They would try to find a way to claim it, or worse, they would find a way to make it feel small. So, I built an invisible shield. I automated 40% of every paycheck directly into my investment accounts. I lived on the same budget I had when I was making $70,000. I kept driving the 2011 Civic with the cracked dashboard. I kept living in the 480 square foot studio. To anyone looking from the outside, I was stagnant. To Eleanor and Victoria, I was a charity case in waiting. There was a specific kind of freedom in being underestimated. Because they expected nothing from me, they stopped looking closely. Eleanor continued to send me links to low-income housing and articles about how to save money on groceries. I would reply with a simple, "Thanks, Mom," and then I would go back to managing a 7-figure client portfolio. The most difficult part was the isolation of the achievement. When you have worked 14 hours a day to reach a milestone that changes your entire life, the first instinct is to tell the people who raised you. You want to see that spark of pride in your father's eyes, or hear your mother say that she was wrong about your potential. But I knew that if I gave Eleanor that information, I was handing her a weapon. She would use my salary to justify why Victoria needed more help, or she would find a way to guilt me into paying for things I didn't owe the family. I was not just saving money, I was saving my peace. I was protecting the version of myself that was finally standing on her own 2 feet. Every night, after the office cleared out and the only sound was the hum of the cooling fans in the server room, I would sit in the silence and realize that I was the only person who knew the truth. I was the lead architect of a global infrastructure, a high earner in one of the most competitive cities in the country, and a woman who was about to buy her way out of a decade of gaslighting. I was the invisible lead, and for the first time in my life, I realized that being invisible was the most powerful position I could ever hold. My mother was busy narrating a story of my failure, but I was the one who was quietly buying the press. The stage was almost set. I just needed to stay in the shadows a little bit longer. By March of 2023, my life had become a study in dual realities. In the professional world of Seattle's tech corridor, I was a force. As a senior manager of infrastructure operations, I was the one who kept the digital heart of a multi-billion-dollar hospital system beating. When a server migration failed at 2 a.m, I was the voice of calm in the chaos, directing a team of 12 through the recovery with zero downtime. My salary was now $165,000, and my secret investment portfolio was growing with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a well-written script. But in the reality of the Vance family, I was a tragic figure. I was the daughter who lived in a shoebox, the one who couldn't quite get her life together, and the perennial recipient of the family's collective pity. It began with a Sunday afternoon phone call from my mother, Eleanor. Her voice had that specific, hushed tone she reserved for when she was talking about a terminal illness or a disgraced relative. She told me she had run into Aunt Patrice at the market, and that Patrice's neighbor in Tacoma had a small basement apartment coming available for nearly $300 less than what I was paying in Seattle. "Shall I get the number for you, honey?" she asked. "I know things are getting tight with the inflation everyone is talking about." I looked at my dual monitors, where a high-level security audit was currently displaying green across all sectors, and took a breath. "I am fine, Mom," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I am not looking to move." Eleanor sighed, a long, dramatic sound that whispered through the receiver. "Oh, Evelyn, your pride is such a heavy thing to carry. Someone mentioned your rent was going up, and I just worry so much about you being all alone in that big city without a safety net." I hadn't mentioned my rent. In fact, I hadn't mentioned anything about my finances to her in over a year. But Eleanor Vance didn't need facts to build a narrative. She was a master architect of perception. After she hung up, I sat very still in the dim light of my studio. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Aunt Patrice. "Hey, honey, your mom said you were looking for something cheaper. I know a guy who has a place near the bus line." Uncle Dennis messaged 10 minutes after that. Evelyn, no shame in downsizing. Let me know if you need help moving the heavy stuff. Then came the text from my cousin Laura. Your mom told my mom you were in a really tough spot. Thinking of you, babe. Within 60 minutes, Eleanor had distributed her version of my life like a corporate press release to every branch of the family tree. I was no longer a successful lead architect. I was a charity case. I was a woman drowning, and my mother was the only one brave enough to throw a life preserver. She had turned my choice to live small and save money into a public emergency. But before I tell you how I handled the messages and the matchmaking attempts that followed, I have to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone in your life, maybe even a parent or a sibling, deliberately painted you as a failure just to make themselves look like the hero? Have you ever achieved something massive only to have it dismissed as a hobby while your character was being picked apart in a family group chat? If you know that specific cold feeling of being slandered by the people who are supposed to be your biggest fans, please hit the subscribe button. I want this to be a community for those of us who had to build our own stages in the dark. And please, drop a comment below about a time someone tried to rewrite your story. I read every one of them, and I think we all need to know that we aren't the only ones dealing with a narrator who refuses to tell the truth. The campaign didn't stop at housing. A week later, I received a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. The man's voice was mid-40s and had that forced, cheerful cadence of a salesperson. He introduced himself as Greg Whitaker. He said my mother had given him my number and that they had hit it off at a local mixer. He mentioned he was in commercial insurance and owned a house in Bellevue outright. He said he would love to take me to dinner because I sounded like a girl who could use some stability. I deleted the message immediately. 20 minutes later, Eleanor texted me, "Greg is a catch, Evelyn. His mother says he is a provider." I replied, "I didn't ask you to set me up, Mom." Her response came back in seconds. "You are 32, Evelyn. No house, no husband, and you are living in a studio apartment with a leaky faucet. I am trying to save you from ending up alone." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. On my scoreboard, I was winning. I had led a migration that week with 0 data loss. My team had sent me a string of party emojis on Slack, calling me the backbone of the department. I had just updated my spreadsheet to show that I had reached my first major savings milestone. But on Eleanor Vance's scoreboard, I was an emergency. She measured worth in real estate and marriage licenses. To her, my titles and my 7-figure client portfolio didn't exist because she couldn't brag about them at a book club. I realized then that Eleanor wasn't just worried, she was invested. She needed me to be the struggling one so that Victoria could remain the golden child. Victoria's success was built on a foundation of the $58,000 my mother had stolen from me, and the only way to keep that secret buried was to make sure I stayed small. If I was the failure, then Eleanor's decision to favor Victoria looked like wise resource management rather than theft. I put my phone face down on the scarred maple table. The light rail train surged past outside, rattling the window in its frame. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark. I didn't yell, and I didn't send a long, defensive text. I just opened my laptop one last time that night. I navigated away from my server logs and opened Zillow. I wasn't looking for a basement in Tacoma. I wasn't looking for a provider like Greg Whitaker. I was looking for the feeling I had been building toward since that Tuesday night call from Uncle Silas. My mother had spent years telling the family I was drowning. I decided it was finally time to show them exactly how well I could swim. I closed my laptop at 11:40 p.m., the deployment was clean, the downtime was 0, and for the first time, I wasn't just saving for a future. I was shopping for the moment the truth would finally come home. 6 months after the Zillow search began, everything accelerated. I was no longer just monitoring server health or managing small teams. I had been promoted again to a senior leadership role, my salary reaching $165,000, plus a significant performance bonus. The index funds I had been feeding religiously for over 2 years, back when I was eating frozen peas in my 480-square-foot studio, had grown with the relentless efficiency of the code I wrote. My spreadsheet, the one I built at 2 in the morning on that cold Seattle night, finally contained numbers that felt like a foundation rather than a dream. I started driving through neighborhoods on Saturday mornings alone, with a cup of black coffee in the cup holder and my phone on silent. I did not tell Diane, I did not tell Uncle Silas, and I certainly did not tell my mother. I was not just looking for a house. I was looking for a feeling. I was looking for the physical manifestation of my own autonomy, a place that Eleanor Vance could never touch or diminish with her words. I found it on a hillside in Bellevue, tucked away behind a screen of ancient Douglas firs. It was a $1.25 million property with 4 bedrooms and a wraparound deck that overlooked a valley draped in mist. The living room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the sunset into a wall of amber and copper light. It had hardwood floors that gleamed like honey and a stone fireplace that reached all the way to the vaulted ceiling. But the centerpiece was the kitchen. It had a massive quartz island with space for 6 people to sit. It was a kitchen where nobody would ever feel like they were being relegated to the kids' table. I ran the numbers 3 times, reviewed my portfolio with a financial advisor, and then I made an offer. When the call came that the offer was accepted, I did not scream. I did not call anyone to brag. I just sat in my 2011 Civic in the parking lot of my office building and breathed. 3 weeks later, I sat in a quiet title office and signed my name 47 times. Each signature felt like a brick being laid in a wall between me and the decade of gaslighting I had endured. When the agent handed me the heavy brass key and the folder containing the deed, the weight of it in my palm was the only reality that mattered. I moved in on a rainy Saturday in early January. There was no moving truck and no fanfare. I simply packed my Civic with the few things that truly belonged to me: my clothes, my laptop, a box of books, and a cast-iron skillet that had survived every rental I ever lived in. The house was empty and enormous. My footsteps echoed off the oak floors, a sharp, clean sound that replaced the rhythmic drip of my old kitchen faucet. The sunlight came through the wall of glass, throwing long, golden rectangles across the bare floor, while the Douglas firs outside swayed in a breeze that smelled like rain and cold earth. I bought furniture slowly and with intention. I chose a deep, gray cushion couch that was big enough to disappear into. I found a kitchen table at an estate sale made of solid maple and slightly scarred from years of use. I liked the scars. They made the table feel earned, like me. One weekend, I spent 14 hours painting the living room wall behind the fireplace a warm, inviting white. My arms ached and my hands were covered in speckles of paint, but I did not mind. For the first time in my life, I was not decorating a temporary space. I was defining my own territory. The only person I invited over during those first few months was Diane Prescott. She stood in my entryway, her silver bob sharp against the vaulted ceiling, and looked out through the glass at the valley below. She was quiet for a long time, the kind of silence that usually preceded a major infrastructure audit. "This is stunning, Evelyn," she said finally. Her voice softened. "Does your family know?" "Not yet," I replied, pouring her a glass of wine. Diane studied my face over the rim of her glass. "You are not punishing them by hiding this, you know. You are protecting yourself." I knew she was right. I was not hiding the house out of spite. I was hiding it because I was not yet ready to hand my mother another thing to ruin. I knew that the moment Eleanor Vance stepped into this room, she would try to narrate it. She would find a fault in the molding, or she would start calculating how many rooms Victoria's children could occupy, or she would turn my success into a story about how her guidance had finally paid off. I needed this space to belong only to me for a while longer. I needed the walls to absorb my truth before they had to endure her lies. That night, after Diane left, I unpacked a small file box I had been keeping in the back of my closet. On the top was the deed to the mansion, a legal document, confirming I was the sole owner of this $1.25 million sanctuary. Beneath it was the manila envelope Uncle Silas had sent me. I pulled out the bank statement from 2010. I looked at my mother's signature, that neat practiced cursive, authorizing the withdrawal of $58,000 that was meant for my education. I laid the 2 documents side by side on the scarred maple table. One was the evidence of a theft that was meant to keep me small. The other was the evidence of a life I had built because I refused to stay that way. The house was more than an asset. It was a $1.25 million rebuttal. It was proof that while my mother was telling the family I was a charity case who could not afford a garage, I was quietly designing a life that was larger than her imagination. I sat at the head of my table, looking out at the city lights scattered across the valley floor like a second set of stars. I realized that for the first time in 14 years, the narrative was no longer out of my hands. I had the key. I had the deed. And I had the silence that was about to become the loudest response I had ever given. The stage was finally built. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to pull back the curtain. Saturday came slowly. I spent the entire morning cleaning, not because the house actually needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I vacuumed the hardwood floors in the living room until they gleamed like honey under the skylights. I wiped down the massive quartz kitchen island 3 times, even though not a single crumb had touched its surface. By noon, I had scones in the oven, lemon and blueberry, and the house smelled like warm sugar and citrus. It was a scent that belonged to a home, not a rental. It was a scent that didn't fit the narrative my family had written for me. I changed into a cream sweater and simple jeans, no makeup beyond the basics, no high heels, no jewelry. This was not a performance. I didn't need to dress up to prove my worth because the house was going to do all the talking for me. I sat in the living room and watched the fog roll through the valley below the deck. For years, my life had been characterized by high latency, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the resources, waiting for the truth to be safe enough to speak. Today, the latency was 0. At exactly 2:03 p.m., I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. I didn't need to look out the window to know it was Victoria's SUV. I stood up, smoothed my sweater, and walked to the front door. Through the sidelight, I could see her sitting in the driver's seat. She wasn't moving. She was just staring up at the vaulted roofline and the stone chimney as if she were trying to reconcile this structure with the mental image of the 480-square-foot studio she thought I still lived in. When she finally got out, her movements were stiff. She held her designer purse in front of her like a shield. I opened the heavy oak door before she could even reach for the bell. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice light and steady. "Come on in. Tea is almost ready." Victoria stepped across the threshold and immediately stopped. Her heels made a sharp, echoing click on the oak floor, a sound that seemed to startle her. She looked up at the 18-foot ceilings. Then her eyes traveled to the iron railing of the staircase, and finally, they landed on the archway leading to the living room. She could see the wall of glass and the entire valley spread out like a painting. Her hand went to her mouth. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She just turned in a slow, disoriented circle. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice sounding small and hollow in the vast space. "What is this?" "It is my home," I replied. She walked into the living room as if the floor might give way beneath her. She touched the back of my gray, deep-cushioned couch, her fingers trailing over the fabric. Then she walked to the kitchen and ran her hand over the quartz island. She opened a cabinet, closed it, and then stood by the glass wall, staring at the Douglas fir swaying in the breeze. "I do not understand," Victoria said, turning back to me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were darting around the room, searching for a flaw, a sign that this was a rental or a staged house. "How did you buy this?" "Mom said you were drowning. She said you were looking for basement apartments in Tacoma. She said you were barely hanging on." I walked over to the stove and turned off the kettle. "I have been a senior leader in infrastructure for a year, Victoria. My salary and my investments covered the down payment. I stopped renting months ago. But the student loans," she stammered, "the tech thing you do, Mom said it was unpredictable. She said you were a charity case." I set 2 mugs on the table next to the scones. "I am sure she did," I said calmly. "But Mom hasn't asked me about my career in 3 years. She preferred her own version of the story." Victoria didn't sit down. She looked like she was having a physical reaction to the reality of the room. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for over a decade, the successful golden daughter versus the struggling tech girl, was evaporating in real time. The shiplap walls and the $30,000 kitchen she bragged about at Thanksgiving suddenly looked very small, compared to the $1.25 million sanctuary she was standing in. She pulled her smartphone out of her purse. Her fingers were shaking so badly she fumbled the device twice before she could get it unlocked. She didn't look at me. She hit a speed dial contact and pressed the phone to her ear. 1 ring, 2 rings. Mom, Victoria's voice cracked. It was a raw, panicked sound. Mom, you need to get here right now. No, I am not at the store. I am at Evelyn's. You have to see this. You have to see this right now. I could hear my mother's voice through the speaker, tinny and sharp with alarm. What is it? Is Evelyn okay? Did she get evicted? Just come, Victoria nearly shouted. I am sending you the address. Just come. Victoria hung up and looked at me as if I were a stranger. She looked at the scones, the tea, and the sunlight rectangles on the floor. She looked like her entire world had been audited and found fraudulent. I gestured to the maple table, the one with the slight scars that made it feel earned. Would you like sugar in your tea while we wait? I asked. Victoria didn't answer. She just sat on the edge of the chair, her knees pressed together, staring at the floor. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the wind through the fir trees outside. My mother was 19 minutes away, and for the first time in 14 years, I wasn't the one who was afraid of what would happen when she walked through the door. I was the one who had designed the architecture of the moment. The stage was set, the audience was arriving, and the narrative was finally mine. Eleanor arrived 19 minutes later. It was a fast drive from Lake Oswego to the hills of Bellevue on a Saturday afternoon. She must have driven like the house was on fire. I heard the crunch of 2 car doors slamming and then the rapid, sharp click of Eleanor's heels on the stone path leading to my front door. Richard's footsteps followed, slower and more hesitant, the sound of a man who had spent 30 years walking 2 paces behind a hurricane. Victoria opened the door before I could even reach for the handle. In here, Mom. Come in, she called out. Her voice was still hovering in that state of raw, disorienting confusion. Eleanor stepped into the entryway. She was wearing a lavender cardigan and the pearl earrings she reserved for high-stakes family events. She must have been getting ready for a dinner party or a gallery opening when Victoria's panicked call reached her. She stopped dead in her tracks 5 feet past the threshold. For 5 full seconds, there was no sound in the house except for the wind whistling through the Douglas firs outside. She looked up at the 18-foot vaulted ceilings. She looked at the iron railing of the staircase. She looked at the stone fireplace and the sunlight rectangles stretching across the oak floors. What is this? She asked. Her voice was thin, a brittle thread of sound that seemed like it might snap at any moment. It is my home, Mom, I said. Welcome. She walked forward as if the floor might not hold her weight. She moved into the living room, her eyes darting from the deep gray couch to the built-in bookshelves I had been slowly filling with the history of my own making. She walked to the wall of glass and stared out at the valley below. But you never said, she whispered. Her face was the color of paper, and her fingers were twisting the hem of her cardigan. How could you possibly afford a place like this? I was told you were drowning. I was told your work was unpredictable. I have been a senior leader at my company for over a year now, Mom, I replied, my voice steady and clear. My salary and my performance bonuses covered the down payment. I stopped renting a long time ago. Senior leader? Since when? She asked, spinning around to face me. Since you stopped asking about my job, I said. Richard was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the afternoon light. He hadn't moved past the threshold. His eyes were red, and his chin was trembling as he looked at me. I am proud of you, Evelyn, he said. His voice barely held together, but the words were the first of their kind I had heard from him in my adult life. Eleanor spun toward him, her eyes wide with shock. Did you know about this? No, I did not, Richard said. He walked across the room past his wife and put his arms around me. He held me for a long time, and he smelled like the same cedar and Old Spice he had worn since I was 10. His hands shook against my back as he let go. The room had shifted. The power dynamic that had governed our family for 14 years was being audited in real time, and the results were coming back as a total failure for Eleanor Vance. Victoria was sitting on the edge of the deep gray couch now, her knees pressed together. She looked up at me, and then she said the thing that finally cracked the dam. I do not understand, she whispered. How did you save enough? You had student loans. Huge ones. Mom said both of our college funds were lost in the market crash in 2008. Yours was not lost, Victoria, I said. The room went airless. Victoria blinked. What do you mean? I walked to the massive quartz kitchen island. My footsteps were the only sound in the house. I picked up the white manila envelope Uncle Silas had sent me and placed it gently on the stone surface. The white of the paper looked clinical against the gray veining of the quartz. I looked at my mother. Her jaw was tight, and her fingers were twisting that cardigan so hard I thought the fabric might rip. That is ridiculous, Eleanor said, her voice rising into that defensive, high-pitched register she used at holiday tables. Who told you that nonsense? Someone who was there? Silas has always been trying to tear this family apart. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just unsealed the flap and pulled out the bank statement from Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union. I laid it flat on the table and pointed to the bottom of the page. This is a custodial account opened in September 2004, I said. Beneficiary Evelyn Vance. Custodian, Eleanor Vance. I slid my finger down to the final line. March 14, 2010. Full withdrawal of $58,750. Authorization, Eleanor Vance. I looked at Victoria, whose mouth was open but no sound was coming out. Then I pointed to the very next line on the secondary statement Silas had provided. Transferred to joint checking account ending in 7741. 2 weeks later, Victoria, your down payment on the Bellevue house cleared that exact same account. Victoria stood up and walked to the table. She picked up the statement with both hands, her eyes tracking the numbers as if she were learning to read for the first time. Mom, she whispered, you told me this was your savings. You told me you and Dad had set aside money for years. You told me Evelyn's fund was gone because of the market. Eleanor's face went from white to a deep, mottled red. I did what was best for the family, she shouted. You needed a house, Victoria. You were getting married. You were starting a life. Evelyn was always fine on her own. She was the stubborn one. She was always going to survive. Fine on my own because I had no choice, I said quietly. Richard was sitting in a chair by the wall now, his head buried in his hands. Gloria, his voice came out as a raw, broken sound. You told me the fund performed badly. You showed me a statement. You showed me losses. She showed you a manufactured summary, Richard, I said. The real account record, the one from the credit union with her signature on the withdrawal, is right there on the table. Victoria put the statement down and pressed her palms flat against my quartz island. She was crying now, the kind of quiet, heavy tears that come when you realize your entire success was built on a foundation of theft from the person you were taught to pity. I didn't know, Evelyn, she sobbed. I swear I didn't know. I looked at my sister, then at my mother, who was still standing by the window looking for a way to rewrite the story. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my own house. Eleanor Vance had spent 14 years narrating a tragedy of my failure to cover up her own betrayal. But standing in this $1.25 million room, with the evidence of her signature resting on the table, she finally had absolutely nothing to say. The audit was over. The truth was the only thing left in the room. The silence in my home that afternoon was not the empty kind I had known in my studio apartment. It was heavy, weighted, with the absolute collapse of a 14-year lie. Eleanor Vance, a woman who had spent over a decade narrating my life as a series of failures to every relative who would listen, finally had nothing to say. The ink on the bank statement was a hard, undeniable fact that no amount of her polished rhetoric could erase. The fallout was immediate and relentless. By the following evening, the story of the Bellevue mansion and the stolen college fund had moved through the Vance family tree like water through a crack in a foundation. Uncle Silas, whether he intended to or not, confirmed the details to Aunt Patrice. And once Patrice knew, it was as good as being printed in the Seattle Times. My phone began buzzing on Monday morning with a rhythm that felt like a system recovery. Aunt Patrice called first, her voice thick with a mix of guilt and shock. Evelyn, she said, your mother told us you were drowning. We had no idea. All these years, we just believed her, because why would a mother lie about that? I asked her if she would have believed my truth over Eleanor's polished version. The long silence on the other end of the line was the only answer I needed. Then came the messages from the cousins. Laura sent a text saying she felt physically ill for every time she had offered me her old furniture. Uncle Dennis reached out to apologize for the downsizing comments. One by one, the relatives started calling Eleanor, but not to offer comfort. They were asking hard questions, the kind she couldn't redirect with a wave of her hand or a pitying smile about her poor, struggling daughter. My mother's response was predictable. She tried to blame Silas, claiming he was bitter and trying to destroy the family. But you cannot talk your way around a signed withdrawal form. One by one, the calls to her house stopped. Patrice didn't invite her to the next book club. Dennis didn't ask her to organize the summer barbecue. My mother had lost the one thing she valued more than her quartz countertops, the narrative. For 14 years, she had been the author of every Vance family story, but now everyone was reading a different version, and they believed it because it was true. Victoria called me 3 days later. I was sitting on my deck, watching a hawk ride the thermals over the valley when my phone buzzed. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Her voice was smaller and more hollow than I had ever heard it. "I keep thinking about that statement, Evelyn," she whispered. "I should have asked where the money came from." I was 23, I wanted the house so badly, and Mom said she had been saving for years. I just didn't want to look too closely. "I am so sorry." I told her that the apology mattered, and it did. Victoria confessed that she had been performing her entire adult life, staging her home and her social media to match the ruler our mother had built. She told me her husband, Todd, had nearly left her the year before because she couldn't stop letting Eleanor run their lives. I didn't need her to be perfect. I just needed her to be honest. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that means something is finally shifting. Before I tell you about the letter I received and the final realization that changed everything, I want to check in with you. If this story has made you look at your own family dynamics differently, or if you have ever had to stand your ground when the truth was being buried, please hit the like button and subscribe. It tells me that these stories of resilience are reaching the people who need them. And if you have a second, leave a comment about how you felt when Victoria finally saw the truth. I read every single one, and your support is what keeps this channel going. 2 weeks after the confrontation, I was making dinner when the doorbell rang. It was my father, Richard. He was alone. He didn't have Eleanor with him, and for the first time in my life, he didn't look like he was trying to hide. He was holding a toolbox. He said he noticed the deck railing looked a bit loose when he was here last, and he wanted to fix it if I would let him. We didn't talk much while he worked. He fixed the railing, I made coffee, and we sat on the deck watching the light change. It wasn't a grand apology, but he was there. He was finally standing in the house I built, without a narrator to tell him how to feel about it. That summer, I was promoted again. I stood in a conference room while Diane Prescott introduced me as the new Vice President of Infrastructure Operations. 200 people on a Zoom call applauded as she called me the backbone of the company. I didn't post about it on social media. I didn't tell my mother. Some things you have to hold for yourself first. The final piece of the puzzle came from Uncle Silas during a quiet dinner at my house. He told me that the college fund hadn't even started with my mother. It was my grandmother, Margaret Vance, who had opened it the year I was born. She had saved $50 a month from her Social Security check and told Eleanor to keep it for my education and nothing else. I cried then, not from sadness, but from the knowledge that even when nobody in my house was looking out for me, someone had been there from the very beginning. I'm sitting in my living room now, looking out at the valley. I have 3 things I've learned that I want to share with you. First, silence is strategy. The loudest response I ever gave my family wasn't a shouted argument. It was a house on a hill and a teapot on the table. Sometimes you have to build in the dark so your success can speak for itself. Second, you don't owe anyone a confrontation, but you owe yourself the truth. The bank statement didn't fix my mother, but it meant she could never rewrite my story again. Third, boundaries are not walls. They are doors with better locks. My mother can knock, but she no longer has the key to rearrange my furniture or my mind. I am the one who decides who gets to stay for tea. Which of those 3 lessons hits the hardest for you today? Let me know in the comments. If you are struggling with someone else's ruler for your life, put it down and pick up your own. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know. If you want to hear another story about someone who refused to stay small in a family that wanted them hidden, I have linked one in the description below that I think you will love. I will see you in the next one.